Bacteria are really powerful engineers. A relatively recent discovery, the paper published in a very influential scientific magazine 3 years ago, and they use the term urbanization equivalent of the capacity to build cities. And because bacteria are quite small, much smaller than amoebas, even if we use microscopes, we can't really see much detail. But there are now very, very powerful microscopes, and scientists use them to detect how bacteria. They discovered actually that bacteria build cities, and these bacterial cities occur all over the planet. In all organisms, for example, occur inside our mouth and tooth. They require very hard surfaces to build cities on: kitchen sinks, ocean bottoms, everywhere. And they typically start, before they start building a city, they sort of talk with each other to decide whether to initiate city building or not. In the world of bacterial communication, this is called quorum sensing. A few bacteria exchange chemical signals, and based on that, decide whether or not to start building the city. If they say yes, then they would really commit themselves to a proper engineering and building project. They find hard surface, and then they start secreting their own building material and start dividing into multiple cells. This is quite an interesting thing. Bacteria produce their own building material. These are proteins, carbohydrates, even DNA is used as building material, lipids, etc. And the process of excreting the building material, cell division, starts until they form small gatherings like small villages. These villages grow, turn into merge into bigger villages. Bigger villages grow again and turn into the first three-dimensional structure that you can see there is a proper bacterial city, spotted by a powerful microscope called a confocal microscope that detects sort of three-dimensional structure. And scientists actually discovered that a bacterial city or few bacterial cities could merge to produce a bacterial megalopolis. So in this picture, you can see three bacterial cities merging together to produce a huge bacterial megalopolis. And on the picture, you can see how the size grows from, say, a few micrometers, 5 micrometers, to about 500 micrometers, the surface turning into a huge city. And what's interesting is basically that bacterial cities produce something similar to Dover cliffs. Before I show you those, there is a scientific term, bacterial biofilm. This is essentially the meaning of this bacterial city. The bacterial biofilm is a huge structure built by bacteria. You can see it here. Those rods that you can see that are connected are individual bacteria. The space between them is their building material. And this is how they produce or generate biofilms or bacterial cities. But here's what happens when they die. They actually calcify. The bacterial colonies, they can't last forever, even though bacteria have been present at the beginning of life 3.8 billion years ago, and they're still present today. But this is what happens when these structures get calcified. These are basically, you can see how big these structures are. These are entirely made of dead bacterial cities that are called stromatolites. And they, it takes billions of years these to get formed. You have some good examples, say, in Australia and many other places in the world. So the purpose of this, of showing you bacteria and amoebas and protists, how they build their own structures, was to show that the proper engineering within the Gaian system started with basic cells like bacteria and amoebas. And we humans, our building skills have roots in the cognitive capacities of these cells. But here's one question that many scientists are asking, certainly scientists like myself and my colleagues who like to think of nature as a sort of cognitive, huge cognitive world, why do we not credit cells for their engineering skills? When I say cells, this means bacteria, amoebas. Many scientists think cells are not that important. I've read in many sort of scientific papers or textbooks that scientists sometimes use the words that are relatively arrogant. They say bacteria are stupid or amoebas are stupid, but when you enter into their cognitive worlds, the worlds of amoebas, bacteria, etc., you realize that they are really very intelligent. So why don't we credit cells for their intelligence, including engineering intelligence? Well, there is no clear answer to this, but my favorite sort of explanation for this is that the science of life, or biology, is organized in a way that what matters when you do research, what matters when you apply for money to get, grants for research, is that you do investigation at the very, very low level, the levels of molecules and genes. And this is called reductionism. And this is kind of normal because we scientists, we have to explain the smallest details. In other words, we have to provide explanatory principles at the smaller details. And in this process, we tend to ignore cells without any intention. So this is like, we focus too much on molecules, genes, and then lose the sight of cells. But the cells are extremely important. This is what makes life. Molecules and genes are important, but they're not deciding factors. And there is a sort of phrase in this cognitive biology and emerging field, the chain of causation remains within the cells. In science, everything is about causes and effects. Science tries to understand all the causes and all the effects in nature. And the current understanding is that we can do that if we investigate molecules and genes. In the process, we forget cells and basically lose the big picture. And organisms like animals and us and plants are made of cells. So whatever cells do in terms of engineering, we sort of recapitulate those skills developed long time ago at the dawn of cognitive biology. But it was not always like this. I mean, there was a time in the science of life when people acknowledged or appreciated cells more than we do today. When we go back to history of science and try to see the development of the science of life through sort of historical lens, we see that the modern way of interpreting cells, in many ways, we miss a big picture as to how these cognitive creatures behave. We only focus on molecules and genes, and this is not entirely correct. And for this reason, some of my colleagues and myself, we trying to sort of change or correct this error of ignoring cells. I call this the changing landscape, and this is the birth or the emergence of cognitive biology. Actually, after I published my book, Biocivilisations, I met few of my colleagues, actually 3 colleagues, who published a book called The Sentient Cell. And then we realized that we're talking about the same thing. So, and 3 of my colleagues are František Baluška, he's a botanist working at the University of Bonn in Germany. Arthur Reber, he's a cognitive psychologist working at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And third is William Miller, Jr. He's a physician, a doctor, but he's an independent scientist. He does not have a university affiliation. So together they published this Sentient Cell, the book. I think it was in August. And in that book, they say life and sentience are coterminous. I say the same in my book. And we actually now want to do a big project, not only doing research, but writing a new book in which we want to put, provide details of this emerging field of cognitive biology in which, the cells are the basic units of sentience, consciousness, and cognition. Just a reminder, sentience simply means sensing, the capacity to sense the world, to feel. You've seen that amoeba in its own shell moving, those tentacles, serve to guide it, and then basically that's amoeba's way of sensing the world. Consciousness means the capacity, the subjective sense of self inside the environment. But I think both sentience and consciousness as terms, their definitions, we are still far from, properly defining those, as it is the case with any developing science. Maybe it's better to leave those meaning aside, but simply do investigation to show that these creatures, these cells that we ignore, actually have very, very rich cognitive worlds.